Welcome all. Welcome to Earnscliffe webinar of COVID-19, Trump, and what's next for Canada-US relations. My name is Alan Gregg. I'm one of 38 principals at the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, we are a public affairs consulting company with subject matter expertise in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. I'm joined by a great panel here today. Sarah Goldfeder is our trade and US specialist in our Ottawa office, former diplomat. She worked with our special guests, so if they start singing Auld Lang Syne in the middle of this conversation, don't be surprised. Brittany Kerr is a principal at Earnscliffe in our Vancouver office. She was the co-chair of the Liberal Campaign Committee in 2019. She's been on every top list that there is, starting with the top 10 under 10 years of age, all the way up to top 40 under 40. She's now facing her biggest challenge and responsibility as a mother. She's on mat leave, so we thank her especially for coming off that to join us. And finally, our special guest is Bruce Heyman. Bruce was the US ambassador to Canada from 2014 to 2017. As testament to his ongoing commitment to the bilateral relationship between our two countries. He's also the co-chair of the advisory committee of the Wilson Center, which is probably the top think tank in the world, dedicated to the understanding of this unique relationship. We have at the bottom the opportunity for people who are in the audience to ask questions. You just have to type in there, and there's one already. They're saying, in addition to Alan Gregg, are any of the other panelists doing this webinar in their bottom of their pajamas? Okay, that's very cheeky. And oh, it's from my wife. I mean, what a horrible thing. There's a little bit of domestic tension after staying in the house for 7-8 weeks. So we'll forget that and start, Bruce, with Ambassador, with you. I mean, historically, when we were in post-grad school, the special relationship Canada had was always with Britain. After the Second World War, that changed. The pivot went to the United States, and ever since then, that has been the special relationship. How would you describe, in your time as ambassador, what the hallmarks of that relationship were when the Obama administration was dealing with Canada?
So first of all, thank you, Alan, and it's good to be back in Canada today, albeit virtually. I do want to take a minute and extend my condolences, first of all, to all those who are suffering from this terrible virus and have had losses in their family, as well as the losses in Nova Scotia, and then, of course, the helicopter accident. These are horrific things to all deal with, and I just want to extend my condolences to everybody who's been impacted by this. You know, when we sit down and talk about the US-Canada relationship, and after I traveled the country, as you call it, from sea to sea to sea, or coast to coast to coast, as we say coast to coast in our country, you know, I came to appreciate and realize that the Canada-US relationship is existential. And for the United States of America, there is no better relationship in the entire world than the relationship we have with our northern neighbor, Canada. But I thought I'd take a few minutes now, Alan, since you've given me that opportunity, to talk through a little bit about, you know, during my tenure, some of the high points of the relationship and some of the things that we worked on, to give you some context before we dive into the current state of affairs and maybe the path ahead. And so let's just start with, I came to Ottawa in the beginning of 2014, and there was this issue called Keystone Pipeline. There was a customs plaza that people wanted the United States to pay for a bridge between our two countries. There were some issues, but in no way, shape, or form were those in any way threatening the overall US-Canada relationship. The US-Canada relationship was thriving in a commercial sense. It was thriving in a tourism sense. It was thriving even as our two governments worked together on many other issues that existed out there. My point is that we can have differences, but yet still we can work together in so many wonderful ways. A specific way which relates to today was when I worked with then Minister Rona Ambrose and worked directly with her on dealing with Ebola and talking about the issue of Ebola and how the president was bringing together allies around the world, President Obama, to fight this potential pandemic, a virus, a horrific thing that was taking place, as we all know, in Africa, and came to Canada as our partner. And you gave money, resources, people, doctors, research, and we came together as real partners in tackling this. That is an example of the many ways we work together. But I thought I'd tell you a bit of a story as to how we were preparing for a potential change in government, your election taking place in 2015. Now, in the embassy, we have meetings that happen all the time, as you know, or you may think, but we have this one meeting called a country team meeting. And that's where we bring together the various parts of the embassy, the various people who work with different agencies of the US government that are posted in Ottawa. And we work together to talk about the various things that are impacting the relationship for good and for improvement. But what I found was that it was almost always tactical and not as much time spending time doing it strategically. And what I wanted to do was, as we were approaching your election, I wanted to get the team to think strategically. And so what I said was, here's what we're going to do. Each member of the country team needs to go back to your counterpart back in Washington and develop a priority list for the US-Canada relationship. And I'm going to force you to not only do that, but I want you to stand up in the next country team meeting and tell everybody else what it is. And why I wanted to do that was, if there's something going on with commerce, it definitely might impact Homeland Security at the border, or vice versa. But I wanted everybody in the embassy to be on the same page. And we did that with every single department of the US Embassy. It wasn't about who was going to be elected. It wasn't whether the Prime Minister Harper was going to be reelected, or Thomas Mulcair, or Justin Trudeau, but it was about setting priorities. And then I did something a little different. I went to Washington with those set of priorities, and I asked the State Department to do something that they said that they don't typically do, but recreate that country team meeting in Washington and bring members of the whole US government, all those departments, including the White House and the National Security Council, together in a meeting to review all those priorities. And so for a moment in time at your election in 2015, we had the entire US government and the entire embassy complex and all of our consulates across Canada all on the same page, all with the same priorities, all with the same focus on the Canadian government and what we would like to do in your next government. Again, regardless of who's prime minister.
I want to get into that a little bit more with Sarah, because we like to flatter ourselves about the relationship, especially when it's working well. But how hard is it to get America's attention with Canada? I mean, Sarah, when you were in the U.S. Embassy in Canada, what did you have to do to get Canada on the radar in the State Department?
Well, the truth of the matter is that there's one person in the United States government that goes to sleep every night and wakes up every morning thinking about Canada, and that is the U.S. ambassador to Canada. So that was Bruce Heyman for the time that he was the ambassador. And beyond that, everybody else is looking at Canada as part of a larger portfolio, part of a larger picture. And so, we talk about a special relationship between the two countries, but the reality is that for Canada, Canada has one special relationship, and the United States has many. And so how all of those play in together can sometimes be a bit of a tussle when you get into the halls and the buildings in Washington. So Canada does have a bit of a battle to ensure that its issues get to the right places and get the right kind of attention within Washington. It is an important relationship, but one of the key factors that makes it an important relationship is that Canada is predictable for the United States. The United States understands how Canada is going to react, when it's going to do certain things, how far the United States can push Canada on certain policy objectives, where the pressure will be coming in from Canada, and how long it will last, and what it will take to get past that particular impasse, whatever it might be. And so that's a really valuable part of the relationship. But it's also important to understand that within every single organization, just like the ambassador pointed out, there are individuals that are focused on how Canada operates within the broader scheme of their files. So there's a Canada desk in the State Department. There's a Canada office in the Commerce Department. There's one in CBP, and there's one in the Department of Homeland Security within the policy shop. So all of those matter, and all of those have conversations within each other, between the group of them. There's deputy meetings where they have all these conversations about how Canada is reacting to things. So it is a part of the conversation, but I think it's really important sometimes for Canada to understand that it is not the most important part of every conversation.
Brittany, Sarah says that one of the things about Canada is that we're predictable. This lovely relationship that the ambassador outlined, I mean, clearly changed quite dramatically in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. I mean, you worked with politicians your entire adult life. How unusual is he in terms of temperament, in terms of the way he makes decisions compared to what you're used to?
Right. Well, interestingly, I was with the Prime Minister the day President Trump was elected, a very memorable day. And certainly the dynamics shifted from the Obama administration to President Trump. I mean, I'm sure everyone, the industrialized world over, is aware that Donald Trump is an unconventional leader. But what makes him an unusual leader in a time like today, one of my colleagues, Charles Bird, described the classic binary that governs President Trump's philosophy, how he subscribes to a win-lose mentality. I win, you lose, versus the traditional win-win that politicians have traditionally strived to communicate to voters. And I mean, taking this pandemic as an example, the president's MO is focused around victory, annihilating enemies, threats, a lot of antagonism toward China. It's not about identifying with loss and grief. It's like there's a deficit of empathy here.
And there's too, and deflections, into something completely not part of the conversation previously.
Right. Well, I mean, we've seen this an unwillingness on the part of the president to admit when he's made these inaccurate claims, which is especially dangerous during a global health crisis. A recent example, of course, we still haven't seen an apology from President Trump for suggesting to Americans that they inject disinfectant to combat the virus. So in terms of how he's making decisions, I mean, we know there's a lot of shoot from the hip for sure, but we shouldn't underestimate how much is governed by what President Trump and his team believe will speak to his base, to his voters. I mean, at present, he can really only see things through a lens of his own prospects for re-election come October.
Ambassador, what are the hallmarks of the new relationship? I mean, you went through what is substantively different now in terms of Canada-U.S. relations compared to when you were?
So think of everything that happened in the post-World War II period, and including all the way up to January 20th of 2017. The U.S. is in a behavior in a multilateral approach to the role that it was taking in the world. And yes, the largest economy, and yes, the largest military, but it was in a collaborative approach. And I think that was even more so with Obama as president, when he was working on things like TPP and the Paris Accord, and functioning with promoting NATO and the authorizations there. But he was constantly thinking about multilateral approaches to solving problems and the way we work going forward. President Trump is a unilateralist. And I think Brittany described it well, that he is all about winning, and his winning is all about America winning at somebody else's expense. And so if he has to win, then somebody else has to lose. He thinks of it in kind of sports metaphors, where in the world of diplomacy, we're always looking for win-win outcomes. In fact, 1 + 1 is 3. I think working with Canada has always been win-win for the two countries coming together. But he doesn't necessarily see it that way. And when there isn't an adversary, he tries to create one, as he's doing right now with this virus and the continual push to find adversaries out in the world. And who knows where that's going to take us. It could take us, he's already blamed the Chinese, and he's blaming Obama for not having test kits, and he's blaming everybody else. He won't apologize for anything. I don't think he's ever apologized for anything. That being said, I think that this is the way he's going to operate, and he's becoming, more an extreme of himself as time goes on. I think he was emboldened by the impeachment process, and now feels he's untouchable. And the only way to stop this, I think, is a change in leadership in the country.
I want to get to all of those things, especially the effect of unilateralism on
Yeah.
Canada in particular. But first, we do have a multilateral relationship with the United States. And Sarah, I don't think I know anyone who followed the reopening of NAFTA and the renegotiation of the USMCA closer than you did. Talk to me about both the process of that negotiation and the outcome. What stands to be different once the deal comes into effect later in the summer?
So I think that's still an open question. The fact is that this deal is going to come into force without a lot of the homework being done before it's ready. And so that's a political decision that the United States has made. Throughout this entire process, the United States has been driving the bus. From the very beginning, it was the president that wanted to renegotiate the agreement, and Mexico and Canada really weren't all that interested. And the things that they wanted to renegotiate never got renegotiated. The one thing that Canada had been telling the United States for literally decades prior to this renegotiation that they wanted to see done in any renegotiation of NAFTA was greater access to labor mobility, more job codes within the NAFTA TN visas. Didn't happen, not at all. And so the things that Canada wanted to see out of a renegotiation eventually didn't end up happening in this renegotiation, and they didn't happen within TPP. And so I think that there was reticence to get involved too deeply in this renegotiation of NAFTA by the other parties, except for to maintain what they had in the original agreement and kind of limit any sort of losses that they might face on the other side. So as we go into this period, once it goes into force on July 1st, there's still things that need to be done in implementation that may take much longer. How that affects trade on the border, it's going to initially slow stuff down, because the fact is that you have to retrain everybody that deals with trade on the border. So CBSA officials that deal with trade going into Canada, CBP officials that deal with trade going into the United States, and the same thing in Mexico. All of those officials have to be retrained in order to properly apply the new tariff rates and the new policies. And some of those are going to be very complicated in moving forward.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because watching that negotiation, I mean, it looked at certain points in time that the thing was going to come unstuck. Is the appearance of winning, that is actually opening up the renegotiation, more important to Donald Trump and this administration than the substance of winning? In terms of the relationship?
Absolutely. This is a declaration of mission accomplished. And so he's going into the final months of the US presidential campaign being able to say, look, I said I was going to renegotiate this deal and get you a better deal, and I did it. And you know what? Between July 1st and November 3rd, no one's going to know if it's better or not.
Brittany, you're still in touch with the Prime Minister and the PMO on an ongoing basis. I mean, what kind of advice would you give the Prime Minister of Canada in terms of how to deal with someone who is as unpredictable and kind of as focused on his base and winning as Donald Trump is?
Well, I would argue that Prime Minister Trudeau and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland have done an exceptional job in dealing with this White House now, especially during the greatest economic uncertainty since the Great Depression, and of course with mounting protectionism as well. It's especially good news for Canadians that Canada has, as Sarah says, has at least begun to secure this trading relationship with the US, which does remain the world's largest economy. Caution, though, of course, is the paramount consideration. I mean, the Prime Minister needs to continue maintaining a productive working relationship and not isolate the president.
In terms of not wanting to set him off.
Right. Don't know how easy that is to do. The other lesson of the last 3.5 years that we've seen is that we can't afford to overreact to anything that the president might say at the spur of the moment. Insults are to be ignored for the most part, and threats are to be dealt with quietly and behind the scenes. The border closure more recently was a good example of how sensitive the state of intergovernmental affairs is with the White House. President Trump musing about the placement of troops at our border. Prime Minister's office did not react impulsively. Rather, they followed their own playbook, worked behind the scenes to ensure that that idea never came to fruition. And, by my count, it was about 24 hours before
Went
we
away.
were able to accomplish that,
Talk about
which is
that playbook. I mean, because a lot of it seems to revolve around using back channels and surrogates. I mean, I know again in the free trade negotiations, the tremendous effort there was to get the governors, to get the business leaders, to use premiers, and is this the new kind of way of dealing with the United States now on this kind of multifaceted basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because, of course, we've seen this rise of regional and cross-border initiatives among subnational governments,
Right.
both state and provincial levels. And, here in British Columbia, that's a really good example of that. What's unique here in BC is that we have a shared cultural identity between British Columbians and West Coast US states. If you take recent public opinion research, 2/3 of British Columbians, they identify more with Seattle than they do with Toronto. So born out of that natural alignment have been a number of really great initiatives, which I know we're going to talk about
Yeah,
later in
I
the
want to
webinar.
get back. That's happening all over North America
Yep,
now.
you
Another
bet.
real reality. But first, there, Ambassador, you were quoted quite bluntly as saying, "I want to make sure I got this right." She says, "Trump has done more damage to the Canada-U.S. relationship than any other person." How so? What specific threats does the Trump administration pose to the Canada-U.S. relationship, and Canada in particular?
So my father always used to tell me when I was younger, and I hear him sometimes on my shoulder, he says, engage brain before putting mouth into gear. And I'll tell you, that is not something our president has ever followed. We started off the relationship saying how bad NAFTA was, which was a signal already that there was a problem and problems were coming. He wanted to negotiate that for a win, as we all discussed, regardless of almost content, but he wanted to get a win. And for him, I think he treated Canada like a construction contractor on one of his projects. He basically squeezed you on steel and aluminum on absolutely no rational basis of national security, but found a way to do it. He threatened your auto industry. He behaved so poorly as you were the host country for the G7 meeting, coming in late, storming out, having a press conference when he shouldn't have, and then the ridiculous actions that he did on the plane on the way out. And then followed that weekend with Peter Navarro said there was a special place in hell for the Prime Minister of Canada. You shouldn't even say that out of the White House about an adversary, no less an ally, no less your best friend and next door neighbor and best trading partner. And of course, we move on with constant threats and insinuations, language that he used about the then foreign minister and then the prime minister. And of course, as Brittany mentioned, troops at the border, or then threatening to withhold masks from you when lives were being threatened. I mean, this is not how you treat a friend and neighbor and ally and someone who I consider to be also having significant amount of family. Relationships are based on trust, whether we do it in our personal lives with our partners, in business, between customers, in business, or between businesses, or between countries. It's based on trust. Trust you work really hard to earn. You can lose trust in a second, and it takes so much longer to earn that back. And I think we have some wounds that have been created. And in my travels across your country during our book tour, that people were telling us that they don't trust the president. Now, the good news is underlying that, they trust Americans like person to person, and business leaders trust each other across the table. And we have this level of trust for the normal working relationship between our governments. But at the White House and what's being directed from the White House, which is not unique to Canada, but you get the impact of it, and we're doing this to our best friend. So, that's the point. I mean, it's every step of the way. And why? He doesn't value relationships.
You mentioned in an earlier response, almost just in passing, China. We did a webinar last week with two very smart guys, Sean Spear and Robert Aslan, and they talked about the emerging Cold War, largely over technology between China and the United States. If that tension starts to rise, again, what's the implications for Canada in that? Whose side are we on in that juncture?
Well, it's going to put you in a very tough spot. And Canada doesn't like to choose sides in these areas. But I think that unfortunately, if Donald Trump is reelected, that you're either with him or against him. And with him is going to be defined in ways that, you can only sit down and imagine and conjure up at this stage of the game, because he's going to make it up as he goes. And so you're immediately going to be on your heels a little bit in the same way that I think you were, although you handled it as a country as well as any country in the world in dealing with this administration, in dealing with the threats that I laid out, in dealing with trying to squeeze you on NAFTA, in dealing with the threats at the border and the masks and everything else, that I think that nobody has been able to handle him better on an international front. That all being said, I think he'll be, again, the extreme of himself in a second administration.
We're going to save enough time at the end to speculate about the November election, because that's always lots of fun. But first, Sarah, we've talked about Trump's tendency towards isolation, to kind of disparage, knock down, or ignore the kind of multinational institutions, multilateral institutions that have kind of governed the world order since the Second World War. You've made the point to me and all your Earnscliffe colleagues that Canada, probably more than any other country in the world, is particularly at risk of that behavior. Expand on that point of view for the people who are tuning in.
Well, so I think part of it is that we have to understand that Canada has benefited greatly from the United States' role as a global mediator, as a global intermediary, and as a leader within multilateral institutions. So no country has benefited more from the United States' role in a positive sense than Canada has historically. And part of that's geography, part of that's the security relationship that Canada and the United States have, which is even closer than the security relationship that we describe as Five Eyes. The relationship between Canada and the United States, it goes far deeper than that. So all of those things fall into risk in an even greater way when the United States retracts itself from the global playing field, decides to act as either as a nationalist. A good example is the trade situation with China. European countries and Canada, the UK, Japan, all had come to the United States at some point or another and said, this isn't just your problem with China. This is all of our problems with China. Let us help you. Let's band together. Let's do this as a team. And the United States said, no, this is something we're going to do on our own. And that issue, the way that they've managed those relationships, I think is really detrimental and in some ways to Canada more than any other country. And so a lot of it is just kind of a thing of scale, that it is the beneficiary when things go well. And so when things go poorly, it's also the first country that really finds that its role in the world stage changes as the role of the United States changes on the world stage.
For that very reason, there are many now who are advocating we shouldn't have so many intersecting relations with the United States. What if Donald Trump tomorrow said, those Canadians are freeloading on NORAD? We should just, get rid of that whole system. Disastrous for us.
It would be absolutely disastrous for Canada. And I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I think we see oftentimes is that Canada benefits from security installations that the United States provides. It benefits from the fact that the United States has bases around the world that Canadians are very often posted at. They're sitting side by side with their American counterparts. Canadian military members are integrated almost fully into the American military, with liaison officers in places that you'd never expect to find them. And so disintegrating that would be really, it would not only be detrimental to the American military to have that kind of value added to it, but it would be detrimental to the Canadian military as well. And I think it's not just the security relationship within the military, it's also the security relationship at the border. Like our physical border between the US and Canada, we can't afford for that to be militarized. We can't afford to put the resources there that we would require if there wasn't a friendly relationship.
You've been monitoring the questions from the
I have.
participants of the webinar. Is anything there that is timely that you want to pose either to the whole panel or to any particular one?
One of the things that the ambassador was speaking about earlier, and I think that there's a question here that speaks to that as well. At what point do Canadians start to rethink the special in the special relationship? But how much abuse and how much of the turmoil will Canadians take from this president, or from the country in general? And along the lines of the discussion that Brittany mentioned of border, troops at the border, the N95 mask question earlier this spring, all of those, at what point does Canada reestablish in its mind what that word special means?
Ambassador, you want to take that one on?
So I would say this to all Canadians: you've got to think the long game. Do not get caught up in the divisive nature of this one man, this president. We will be beyond this man. I hope it's not 4 more years, but it might be. And even if it is, that we will get through this period and we will be at the back end. You see, the thing is, we live next door to each other, so neither of us are moving. And we share this great North American continent together. And with that, and with all the resources, and with the ability and the supply lines that we have, and with the natural allies that we have within the world, I think that we will be fine long term. But it's going to be painful. It's painful for many of us within the country to see some of the things that he's doing and saying, and the disruption to the rule of law, and the disruption to, our normal operations of society. He is, what most presidents historically have done is be the president of all the United States. We call them United States for a reason, but he is the president of the divided states. And so at the end of the day, this will be fine. But in the interim, there are going to be paths for you to work with, like the regional governors groups that are now coming together and showing good force in New England and New York, in the Midwest, in the West Coast, and even the South. I think the rise of the governors is going to be, something that is not going to go away after this virus, and will especially be in place in a second Trump administration, God forbid.
Speaking of that divide, I mean, one of my favorite lines came from Gwynne Dyer. He says, Canadians have no frame of reference for understanding America at all, because half of America is exactly like Canada. Boston's just like Toronto. And the other half is exactly like Tehran. I mean, we just have the prospect of people with firearms rushing our provincial legislature to protest physical distancing is incomprehensible to Canadians, as is the election of Donald Trump. The notion that Donald Trump could be elected in Canada is just inconceivable to most Canadians. Brittany, what's your take? I mean, what is this guy's appeal? What is his enduring kind of qualities as a political commodity that gives him a standing chance in America?
Well, the question might be better posed to the ambassador. I
We'll
will
get to the
say,
ambassador on this one. Don't worry about that.
Alan, you said it best in a recent conversation. We know from public opinion research that most Canadians identify Democrat, even among conservative voters.
Mm-hmm.
We
They
also
might be
know that
blue
we have
Democrats, but they're definitely blue Democrats. There's no Rand Paul supporters in Canada.
Yeah, thank goodness. We also know we don't really have a socio-political culture in Canada that compares to parts of the United States. Biloxi, for example, Red Deer here compares better to Boston, say, than there. And Canadians, therefore, generally don't have that frame of reference, as you say, to understand the Trump voters' worldview and political outlook. The US, of course, has traditionally been prone to polarization as well, to a much greater extent than here in Canada, I would argue, dating back to their Civil War. And President Trump is a master of polarization, as the ambassador said. He has a highly developed sense of what motivates his supporters. And he's very skilled in the art of modern communication, nowhere more so than when it comes to his own base. You know, he's not afraid to play to their grievances and point fingers, whether it's at immigrants or foreigners, multilateral bodies, Democrats. But we know incumbency is a huge advantage. In recent history, there have only been a couple of presidents, Ambassador, I think you were saying that recently, where they were reminding us that where they have not won re-election. And in spite of President Trump's ability to shock and sometimes disgust, I don't know, it seems to me there's a degree to which the American public has become numb to it a little bit over the last 3.5 years. I hope I'm wrong when I feel that way. Though I will say it seems like it's going to be a long 6 months till
We're
November.
going to get to more politics in a second, but first, I mean, we talked about the historic relationship, how it changes when Donald Trump gets elected. Now things aren't complicated enough. Let's just throw COVID-19 in there. How does this pandemic and how it's being handled in the United States and in Canada stand to impact on Canada-US relations? And is there any prospect of a permanent impact and a permanent change as a result of COVID-19, Ambassador?
So I think of it this way. We're all now sheltering in place. Many of us are all calling in from our homes, different parts of our homes on this Zoom call. And we walked in on a given day. We're going to hopefully walk out very, very soon, knock on wood. And let's say it's 60, 90, 120 days, whatever the number of days are. The fact of the matter is, it's not in terms of the economy, in terms of everything that's transpired. I think you've moved ahead 5, maybe 10 years in terms of accelerating the things that were already in motion. And so what was already in motion was the demise of hard box retail. What was already in motion was, the way people, communicate, and this new way we're communicating here and how we're going to get together as a community. Everything's accelerating at an incredibly fast pace, and you don't go backwards now. So I think the things that are going to impact us will be the acceleration of some of these other things that were going on. And that is isolation, this internally focused United States that may be exacerbated, especially if we keep this very high level of unemployment and stress and frustration. It will be exacerbated if he continues to use China as the example. He was already going at China from a trade perspective. Now he's going to go at it in other ways. And so this is going to accelerate things that were already in motion. And I would say with the US-Canada relationship, there are a lot of opportunities that I hope we can go over, in this conversation. But there are a lot of opportunities for our relationship going forward. But you cannot sit on your hands now. Things are moving so fast. If you have a business idea, if you have a community idea, if you have an idea, go for it, try it, give it a go. I always joke with people that there's always a process in the United States, but in Canada, it's a process. For some reason, process takes longer than process. And I'm just going to say, speed up the process of everything you do in how you move and how you communicate and how you do your business. Otherwise, on a global basis, we'll fall far behind. Look, you have your number one company in your country now was hardly in existence just a few years ago, Shopify.
Yeah.
And so here's a company that has grabbed hold of the new world that exists out there. But they shouldn't be alone at this. Your entire country should grab it. Don't rest on what worked before. Grab what will work going forward and take some chances and do it. I think that's your opportunity set. And if you do that, I think it's happening in the US and it's happening in profound ways. The NASDAQ is back up for the year. There's no decline in the NASDAQ, which represents much of technology in our country.
I want to get into opportunities.
We're going to be in a technological world. And I think that plays to Canada's advantage, actually.
I want us to get into that a little bit more, but first, we've got, just listening to you, I mean, there's the panel here. We've got, a global pandemic that is pointing out to and causing many people to question the wisdom of globalization. We've got an American president whose first instinct is America first and protectionism. You put those two together, I mean, what are the impacts, Sarah, of those factors on North American commerce, which isn't going across the internet? I mean, it's going across the physical border by and large, and especially our North American supply chains.
Well, and it's interesting because a couple of the other questions on the Q&A are on this as well. Specifically, are we looking at thicker borders, and are we looking at increased trade protectionism? And are we looking at the need to renegotiate some of these trade agreements, one of which comes into force on July 1st, because we're putting increased measures on foreign direct investment and other things that might run afoul of trade agreements eventually. And so I think we really do need to understand that this is going to affect the way we think about supply chains. Is it the demise of globalization? No, absolutely not. Because what we have learned is that, as China was closing down, there were other places in the world that were still manufacturing. And in fact, many companies that had supply chains that relied on China had to readjust and look in other places. And now they're going back into China because those supply chains, for example, Mexico has shut down almost all manufacturing. So now they have to look back over to China. So having redundancies within the system and in a diverse and agile supply chain is going to be even more important, I think, in the future than it is right now. What does that mean for North America? It means that those integrated supply chains between Mexico, Canada, and the United States are ever more important. And so I think that what we may see initially is a slightly thicker border, slower processes. Some of that will be because there's a new trade agreement that we're enacting, and so there's a learning curve that goes with that. Some of that will be because there's a whole new set of protocols that are related to COVID-19 that people are having to go through, and that's going to slow down things as well. But I think the reality is, and I think most of us, anyone who's ordered online in Canada in the last couple of months will have received packages from the United States with some delays. And it's not really clear what those delays are from. And some are processing, and some are just the cross-border issues, and some are the entirely within Canada issues. So I think overall, we're not going to see a decrease in the importance of these two countries in the trade relationship. And I think that even within a protectionist environment in the United States, there is an understanding that at some point you have to look to your integrated supply chains that involve American companies with Canadian subsidiaries. So there's a desire for the economic benefit of the entire continent wrapped up into this agreement that we have, and also into our overall supply chains and the nature of trade.
Brittany, you mentioned earlier that more British Columbians identify with Seattle than identify with godless Toronto. We're seeing more and more of these regional alliances occurring, a lot of them around COVID, as a consequence of the federal government's kind of hands-off position. But talk to me about what's happening on the West Coast in terms of the innovation corridor that has developed there, and whether you see these subnational alliances and agreements being more and more a part of the North American way of doing business.
Yeah. Well, you referenced the innovation corridor, the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. I mean, when you think about the cultural similarities that we share here on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest in particular, it's no surprise that this initiative has gotten off the ground. What it is it links Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland, and it's an effort to position the Pacific Northwest region as a global hub of innovation, commerce, effectively positioning it as a single innovative economic zone. But in terms of the relationships, I mean, we know that BC Premier Horgan and Washington Governor Inslee, as an example, they've developed a strong and collegial relationship, as the governor did with former Premier Clark. And more recently in the US, and of course we can probably learn more from the ambassador, but we've seen multiple states band together to coordinate action around obtaining PPE, much needed medical equipment during this pandemic, and as well as sort of determining how best to reopen their economies. This is clearly a result of a perceived failure of the federal government to provide any sort of coordinating role Of course, President Trump has shown open disdain for the guidelines issued by his own administration as to how the reopening should be sequenced. So it's little wonder that states have decided to take matters into their own hands.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to spend some time or leave some time to talk about American politics, hard politics. But first, one last question on the substantive side of the Canada-U.S. relationship, Ambassador, because a number of points that have been made here that, how long is our special relationship going to be special if we continue to be brutalized by things like tariffs on aluminum and steel? And on the other side, as you said, the border's not going anywhere, geography's not going anywhere. Where are the win-win relations in Canada-U.S. relations available right now, even under an administration such as this one?
So like all relations, which I talk about because I think country relations are just like relations between people, that, it requires nurturing. To have a good relationship with another person, it requires an investment of time on both sides. That being said, I think that there are some key things that I would recommend that we look at as guideposts for how we may want to move forward. The first is, and you had mentioned it, is NORAD. So look at NORAD, look at our Nexus program, look at our Shipwriter program. For those who don't know what these are, we'll be glad to go over them, but if we have time. Also look at NAFTA, but look at ways in which we can retain our sovereignty, where Canada can keep its sovereignty, the US keep its sovereignty, but yet we can work together to accomplish things that unite us in ways that are, far-reaching. I'll tell you, the NORAD, to have a joint command where you actually have a general in US report up to the Prime Minister of Canada, and you have senior members of the military report up to the President of the United States, is an innovative concept that doesn't work anywhere else in the world like this. And you have these opportunity sets. The Shipwriter, we used to sit down and ships would go back, bad guys would go across our shared waterways, and, the RCMP would chase them and have to stop, and then they go across the US and vice versa. And they kept saying, well, we can't give up sovereignty. We can't do this. We can't let the US borders go over here, and we can't let RCMP come over here. But yet somebody said, well, what if we just put a ship with both on? Or when we had the Nexus program and we do these joint interviews together, we can do this. And so let's leapfrog, think out of the box. Think of ways we can deal with our shared commerce, shared border in ways that are transformational, using those as kind of guideposts. And by the way, I don't think I do it from the government perspective. I think people on both sides of the border would rather see it develop within our citizenry. And so, call up Goldie Hayer, call up Canada 2020, call up, the Wilson Center in Washington, and where I'm on the advisory board, call up the Chamber of Commerce, bring these business leaders together, Penwar out west, the Council of the Great Lakes, which is really operating with Mark Fisher. All of these people, bring these people together, bring the CEOs of these great companies that we have on both sides of our border that do business together, and let's do a hackathon. Let's put down some issues. Let's try to solve some of the not problems, but just think about the future and how we can work together. I think we can come up with some really good ideas and let government try and work with us to implement it. But if it bubbles up, I think
sounds like we've got a new assignment for you, Ambassador, right there. But first, Sarah, again, any further questions you're seeing from the larger group out there that you think might be good for the conversation?
Absolutely. There's a couple of questions, and I think I'll just kind of paraphrase them. There is a disconnect between the Trump administration's goals and the government of Canada's goals under the leadership of the Prime Minister, especially on climate change, oil and gas, and just most recently, although I think this is kind of a sovereign issue that neither country really wants to get into the other one's space on, but with the banning of AR rifles here in Canada. But I think overall, the real question is, how do these two countries align themselves when there's a philosophical difference that is pretty significant on some of these key issues? And I kind of highlight especially the energy and environment piece.
Why don't you answer that, Sarah? Because I know you've got an answer to that question.
Well, I mean, I think that there is a lot more alignment that we see within the consumer base in both countries and within the states and the desires of some of the states to be more forward leaning on climate change interactions and climate change action than it would appear if you just look at the two federal governments. I think that the reality is that for the energy sector, consumers vote with their pocketbooks. Consumers vote by what they choose to do, and so you see. I think in many ways you see a push towards more electric vehicles entering into the fleet in both countries, and you see in some places a desire to hold on to the F-150s. And so the divide on these issues, I think, is very similar in both countries. There is a question of politics there that is tricky. And there is a piece of, there's a moment of opportunity right now where we see on oil and gas, where we see kind of a leveling out of supply and demand within North America. So maybe there's some opportunities there for the two countries to work together to figure out how to decrease the reliance on oil and gas coming in from other places. But I think overall, the answer to this question is that it's not so much the politics of the leaderships. It's the consumer base, which is the citizenry of Canada and the United States, and the alignment there, and the division within both countries on some of these issues.
It's an interesting theme that is kind of evolving as we talk. But let's get to politics. I mean, Brittany, we've seen an incredible kind of fall and rise of Joe Biden over the last 2.5 months. He looked like he was a goner, had no chance at all, and then after South Carolina and Super Tuesday came, surging back. How would you rate him as a politician? What are his strengths and weaknesses?
Mm. Well, I'm going to keep my comments brief because certainly Ambassador Heyman will have far more insightful perspectives
Very
to share.
interesting what you have to say here, though.
I think it's fair to say that many had written off Joe Biden's chances of securing the nomination until South Carolina. I think many Americans and folks around the world felt he'd probably been eclipsed by his rivals, who were in many cases younger, widely perceived to be on the more progressive wing of the party. There's little doubt that African Americans were a big part of the success, as were Hispanic Americans and other minority groups. But the big takeaway, I have to think, is those who voted for Biden did so primarily out of a sense that he was the best positioned to beat Donald Trump in November.
Well, just a supplementary on that. I mean, is he going to be able to stand up to Trump when he calls him Sleepy Joe and does his whole insulting?
Turning it over to you, Ambassador.
We should make it known, truth be told, the ambassador is actually working on the Biden campaign, very close to Amy Klobuchar. And what has he got to do to win? What are the 3 things that just have to happen for it to change in the White House?
Look, I don't think anybody wins the presidency by just being different than the person that they're running against. They have to provide a compelling vision for the country. They have to sit down and lay out what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and the way they're going to do it. Now, they also have to, just because they're not running in isolation, they run against another person. And I think Donald Trump has given, a lot of material to run against. And I think that you have to, because there's so much material, you're going to have to aim very carefully, and you're going to have to find those weaknesses, and you're going to have to go at those. Importantly, though, you're going to have to get the vote out. And the Republicans are well known as suppressing the vote. And they do whatever they can to lower the voter turnout. And Democrats have to do whatever they can to raise the voter turnout. That means Democrats need to be inspired, and they need to have something that they're voting for and looking forward to. I think Republicans vote out of perspiration and duty, especially his core. If they vote for Donald Trump, they're going to vote for anything. And when we're looking at the Democrats, I think they need to be inspired. But I also think that there is an entire group of Republicans that are really frustrated and just give me something to hang on to, because I don't really want to support this guy, but I can't go too far left. I think that's why Joe's where he is. I think that having the support of the Obamas in here and all of the other endorsements that he has are coming together. He's doing online fundraising, which is hard to do. Look, running against an incumbent's really hard, as Brittany and I think Sarah had mentioned. Very few people have lost. I think in 100 years that it was Herbert Hoover, George H.W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter. I mean, all of those faced a really bad economic period, which I'm not rooting for, and I hope that we get out of this thing, but we definitely have our challenges there. But he has demonstrated that he's not held to the rule of law. And he's going to do whatever he can to win this election. So we have to have overwhelming numbers and really push hard. It's going to come down to about a half a dozen states. And it's within those states, it's going to come down to about 20 counties. And you're going to spend billions of dollars across the country on about 20 counties for outcomes for this election. One last point that I'd like to raise.
Go ahead.
And that is, and look, the numbers may be different now, especially given the virus. But here it is in Canada. This is where you have a really important role to play. That is Americans living in Canada, not Canada itself. The US government Foreign Voter Assistance Program, FVAP.gov. And the Foreign Voter Assistance Program is a nonpartisan effort to get Americans who live abroad, whether it's military or otherwise, to vote. And according to the US government, over 3 million voting eligible Americans lived abroad at 2016 election. And the country with the largest number of eligible voters is Canada, the number one. Now, according to the US government, their own calculations, 6% voted out of Canada in 2016.
6% of Americans.
6% of the Americans who are eligible to vote, which are in the hundreds of thousands of eligible voters. Michigan, for example, was lost by 11,000 votes. Can I possibly believe that there may be more than that in Canada? Yes. And in a nonpartisan voice, I did this as ambassador. I'm sure the embassy will do this as well this year. But I'm going to make an effort to get Americans living in Canada to get out and vote. And the best way to do it is fvap.gov. Go in, register to vote. You're going to hear a lot from me and from Vicki over the next few months. We need you to vote.
We're not going to get Joe Biden stumping in Thunder Bay, are we? That's not going to happen. No.
I hope he has thunder somewhere else in the United States that gets people.
Sarah, I mean, Brittany talked about most Canadians. Their sensibilities tend to be progressive, center,
Yeah.
center left. And there, if you had to guess, most would hope that they would like to see a Democratic White House and probably both houses of Congress. Let's say for a second that happened. We talked about the historic nature of Canada-US relations, what's happened under Trump, how COVID-19 has complicated and accelerated that in the ambassador's words. What would be different if Democrats controlled the US politics?
Well, I think we
The
get back to
Canada-US relations. I'm going to ask Sarah on this one, Ambassador.
Go ahead, Sarah.
So, I mean, I think there is an axiom in the US-Canada relationship that normally a Republican leadership in the United States is better for Canada than Democratic leadership. But what we have at the moment hasn't really proven that to be true. So I think that in many ways, a Biden administration would act in ways that were definitely more collegial and friendlier to the multilateral approach that would align better with what Canada's sensibilities are. I mean, the reality is that Canada needs the United States to play in the multilateral institutions that it normally plays in. Canada needs the United States.
And the Democrats would
Democrats would be far more likely, and some of this has shifted over the years, but the Democrats are far more likely at this point in time to be willing to engage in the UN, to be willing to engage and to fix the WTO, to be willing to engage and fix the WHO. And so all of those things are things that the Canadian government would, I think, very much support, and the American administration under a President Joe Biden probably would align well with. The areas where there might still be some ongoing tension, we continue to see the KXL situation play out. There's now another stop on that project. And so there's some of those areas that I think would continue to be a challenge. But it's like, Condoleezza Rice said, a lot of the key issues between Canada and the United States are condominium issues. They're little things that we fight over, and they are hardy perennials that come back time and time again, but they don't affect the underlying status of the relationship and the way that some of the actions of the Trump administration have.
Now, the tyranny of time is upon us. So I want to go around the horn, a little bit of fun, a little bit of predictions about who's going to win the White House, who's going to win control of the Senate, who's going to control the House of Representatives, starting with you, Brittany.
Oh, how depressing. I'm going to say Trump.
Oh.
And yeah, I do. And I'll reserve my comment at that, at risk of offending anyone.
What do we have to do for another Trump administration? What would we have to do different, or just kind of continue to roll with the punches?
To me, yeah, no, I think it's an eventuality that we have to be prepared for. And I mean, our government has laid the groundwork, as we've discussed on the webinar, for the last 3.5 years. A really good, I'd say, case study as to how we should be dealing with a Trump White House again. I will say, if he is reelected, I have concerns about how he'll see that as a vindication of his conduct over his last term, and how emboldened he might be, especially because the prospect of reelection will no longer be hanging over his head. You've really got to wonder what the next 4 years would look like.
Well, he might suggest a third term. That's always possible. Sarah, let's hear your predictions. I know in the past you've been interesting, your predictions, because they've
yeah, because I was the first one. I think kind of coming out of the gate after the 2016 election, I said this looks like a two-term president, and I still feel in many ways this looks like a two-term president. And what worries me the most is the incumbency. That's a privilege when you're going into an election, and the fact right, and we're in a situation right now where voting is going to be hard in November. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. When voting, it's going to be difficult to get to polling stations, and states are going to have to, really think hard about what this looks like. And when voting is hard, that means voting turnout drops. And when voting turnout drops, that usually hurts the Democratic candidates. So I think that the Democrats have a real hill to climb in this election that in some ways is counterintuitive to those of us who watch the United States and look down there and say, oh my goodness, how can they think that this is going to be good for another 4 years? But I think the sad reality of some of it is that the incumbency and the vote, the difficulty of voting in the 2020 election as a unique experience in our history is going to favor an incumbent over new candidates. And so I'd like to say that I think there's a change coming, but I'm just not sure.
Last word to you, Ambassador.
It's not going to be close. Biden's going to win. He's going to win handily. We're going to win the Senate, and we're going to win the House.
Win the Senate as well.
The Senate as well. The Senate is in tip, and I've been on the phone with all these senatorial candidates in these red to blue states, many of them from Maine to North Carolina to Iowa, to Kansas even, and Montana, all this last week. And I was on the phone with Joe Biden on a call this week, and I can tell you, from a Canada-U.S. relationship, there's nobody better in this race than Joe Biden relative to Donald Trump. It's not even close. But here's the deal. Look at 2018. Look at the turnout. Look at what happened to the House. Look at 2000, just recently in Wisconsin. And what happened in Wisconsin, they tried to force everybody to turn out, as Sarah talked about. The virus was there. People stood in line. Everybody predicted it would be a huge Republican win. I think that was a really bad signal for the president. And I think that women in general, who are likely heavy voters, are turning out in big numbers in terms of what we're seeing in fundraising and in organizing. I think that this is going to be and Blacks, the Latino community, women, I think it's going to be a big win for the Democrats this fall.
What last supplementary question? Because what about blue collar workers? I mean, the notion that blue collar workers would be supporting Donald Trump would make FDR roll over in his grave. What are the Democrats going to get that constituency back?
Well, I sure hope so, because as it's demonstrated from the very beginning, that was all a fake. That he said he was there for the blue collar worker and he was going to bring all these jobs back. He didn't bring the blue collar worker jobs back. He gave a tax cut to the very wealthy. And what ended up happening was that blue collar workers had to cobble together dual career couples, multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And now we have all of these layoffs, and they're happening at the lowest end of our, employment structure and the income structure. I think that these people will be very hard pressed to follow Donald Trump. There's a core that will vote Republican regardless of who's there or what's there. But aside from that, I think Joe's going to win the blue collar voter, especially in these swing states, which we're talking about. That's going to all matter.
Old mentor of mine said, whenever you make a prediction about the future, never put a date on it. Unfortunately, we've got a date on this one, so we'll come back to all of you. I want to thank you very much. Our special guest, Ambassador Bruce Heyman, Brittany Kerr, colleague from the West Coast, and Sarah Goldfeder from Ottawa. And thank all of you who joined. It was a good crowd we had today. We've recorded this. I'll send you out an email link so that you can have it as part of your archive. Those who registered and weren't able to attend for whatever reason, we will do the same. Also, if you have any questions that you want to pose to any of the panelists that you weren't able to get to, send them back to me as part of the email of correspondence that we engage in, and that we will get back to you. So with that, thank you all. Be safe. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.